You might very well think that. I could not possibly comment.
A warning. This documentary does not discuss how to install the various M4-78 mods that have appeared throughout the years. If you wish to know how to install M4-78 Enhancement Project, please click on this link to learn how to do just that. Chapter 1. The M4-78 that was. This is a history of M4-78 in Obsidian Entertainment's Knights of the Old Republic 2, the Sith Lords. What was M4-78? Well, M4-78 was supposed to be one of the planets that your main character could travel to in order to find the missing Jedi Master Lona Vash. Lona Vash was one of the masters that were at the trial of your character, yet didn't appear anywhere else in the standard version of the game. Well, why was M4-78 cut? I'm going to quote here from Chris Parker. He was the producer of Knights of the Old Republic 2, the Sith Lords. Quote, "From a personal perspective, the best decision I made on the project was probably to back off from design. I like to be involved in design, but Avalon and I both had too much work to do for me to stomp on his toes all the time. So after a few months of minor headbutting, I decided to just let him run with the design and only curtail their efforts when it was out of the question. That's a bit of an oversimplification, and I'm sure Chris would say I still stomped on his toes a lot. The game's better for it. It didn't always make production easy, but making games isn't easy. So as long as it made the game great, that's all that matters. And it did. From a production perspective, the best thing that we did was to cut M4-78, the droid planet. I won't go into details, but we had this incredible design for a planet of droids. We actually did the first pass on art and built the character models for the location. But we had to look at the schedule and make a big cut after E3. We cut the entire planet. At the time, we were afraid that it would make the game too short, but fortunately there is so much other content that wasn't the case. And we used a lot of the elements from that planet elsewhere in the game. Ultimately, I think it made the game better, but it really hurt at the time, especially for the designer who had almost finished the planet, Kevin Saunders. And there's this quote from Dan Spitzley, who's on the KOTOR 2 programming team.
It's easier to leave it on the disc than to try to pull it off and accidentally remove something you really needed.
And from Chris Avalon, he's the lead designer and head writer of KOTOR 2, he said this about M4-78. Quote, "You may want to ask the lead producer on Tides of Numenera, Kevin Saunders. He likely knows more than I. He was the area designer for it." Unquote. Finally, I'll read a quote from Kevin Saunders, who's been mentioned before. He was on the design team. Quote, "Some history. M4-78 was my first assignment when I began working at Obsidian Entertainment in April of 2004 as a senior game designer reporting to lead designer and company creative director Chris Avalon. A brief outline of the area had been written by Dave Maldonado. That was a starting point, but Chris let me take it wherever I wanted and modify the previous plans as I saw fit. I don't recall exactly, but perhaps I worked on the area for about a month all told before we wisely decided to cut it. There was just too much work to do to complete the game, and we had to focus. Given the options, M4-78 was an obvious cut to make. If I recall correctly, the contenders were M4-78 and Nar Shaddaa, and the latter was far more central to the plot. As has been noted by the community, I was able to repurpose some of the M4-78 content to allow Goto's yacht to be implemented more quickly later in the project. It also might have been cut otherwise. I remember Chris was talking to me about how, reluctantly, the yacht might need to go. All of the art was done, but very little of the design, and we were close to the end of the project. I committed to him that I could design and implement it within a week. He trusted me to do so, and while it wasn't our best area, it felt great to deliver it for Chris and the game. Jason Schreier of Kotaku.com, in an interview with the CEO of Obsidian Entertainment, Fergus Urquhart, wrote the following, quote, "Although KOTOR 2 was released in December 2004, it was never quite finished. Deadline restrictions forced Obsidian to remove a great deal of content. Planets, scenes, and plot points were all left on the cutting room floor. Crafty modders would later find and restore this content, as Obsidian left it in the game's source code, but back in 2004, it was all just scrapped. As a new developer, they wanted to make sure that their publisher was happy so they could all work together again," Urquhart said. So Obsidian sucked it up. They went through the game and cut out what they could, including a ton of scenes, some quests, and even an entire area, the droid planet M4-78. They also didn't have enough time to do a proper bug testing, although Urquhart thinks people have been rather harsh on Knights of the Old Republic 2 over the years. And now we're finally back to me. Now that I knew the why, it was important to try and find out what was cut. The information I had heard was the majority of the M4-78 materials were on the Xbox disc only. Well, what was left on the discs? How much dialogue? How much of the maps? How many of the voice files? Zibble 2, lead of the M4-78 enhancement project, had this to say.
You are mostly right. The original M4-78 modules were found on Xbox discs along with HQ Factory. They were pretty empty. As I recall, there were some random droids and a bunch of boxes placed around, and there was also a green fog everywhere in central and environmental zone. You couldn't interact with any of the NPCs though, as there weren't any dialogues for anyone.
Were the materials only left on the Xbox disc? Some materials were on both the Xbox disc and the PC version.
Some text for the planet came from a game's main dialogue file, dialogue TLK, which was the same for PC and Xbox. That's where modders were able to find a basic outline of the planet's plot, like Archons, deactivated M4-78, Ka, Sith involvement and their lies, L565, possibly some other minor details that I cannot recall right now. There are also sound files for Vash and IS-24 that can be found in game stream voice folders. Interestingly, both Vash and IS-24 had multiple copies of the same sound files copied across multiple folders.
Another interesting thing about those files left on the disk, the models of the Archons, the droid intelligence centers, had intriguing placeholder models. They were sharks. As seen here, the main Archons in the M4-78 modules used the Phyraxan sharks and the progenitor model. These models were originally seen in the Manon level of the first Knights of the Old Republic game.